Louisa? He didn't waste another second. He stood up with her in his arms, fury radiating from every inch of his being. "I'm taking her to the hospital," he declared, his voice fierce and unyielding. "Ben, Art, come with me." Ben, though shaking and teary, quickly followed. Art trailed closely behind. When they reached the car, Callum carefully placed Louisa in the back seat. "Art, support her head," he ordered, his tone urgent but steady. Art nodded and gently cradled her head while Ben climbed in beside his mother, still trembling. Once the doors were shut, Callum slammed his foot on the gas, speeding down the road, ignoring the potholes and bumps. Nothing mattered now but getting Louisa help. At the hospital's emergency entrance, he jumped out and carried her inside. "She lost consciousness," he called out. "She was attacked. She needs help now." A doctor and 2 nurses rushed to take her from his arms and wheeled her quickly into a treatment room. "We'll take care of her, sir," the doctor assured him. Ben collapsed on a nearby bench, sobbing uncontrollably. My mom. Callum knelt beside him and pulled the boy into a tight embrace. "Shoo, it's okay, Ben," he whispered. "Your mom's going to be fine. Don't worry. The doctors are taking care of her now." Art stood silently behind them, nervous and shaken. Callum looked up and nodded at him, a silent signal that everything would be all right. "Thank you for bringing me to her," Callum said quietly to Art, resting a hand on his shoulder. Art nodded, trying to hold back tears. A few minutes later, the doctor emerged from the treatment room with a slight smile. "She's stable," he said. "She collapsed most likely from extreme emotional and physical stress. She also has signs of past trauma, bruises, high fever, and severe malnourishment." Ben sat up immediately. "Can I see her?" "Not just yet," the doctor replied gently. "She needs rest, but she's safe now." Ben began crying again, and Callum wrapped an arm around him tighter. "You're strong, Ben," he said softly. "Just like your mom. She's going to be okay. I promise." Callum stood silently for a moment, staring at the door where Louisa had been taken. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of opening old wounds and slowly healing them. The hospital room was quiet. The only sound was Louisa's soft, steady breathing as she remained asleep. Callum stood at the foot of her bed, eyes fixed on her pale face. This woman who once meant everything to him, the woman he had once promised forever. Seated beside the bed, Ben held his mother's hand tightly, his young face lined with worry, his head bowed, eyes shut tightly as if in prayer. Callum clenched his fists at his sides. "Louisa, what happened to you?" he wondered. "The woman I loved, so full of life. Now she's only a shadow of who she was." He never thought he'd see her again. And certainly not like this. Not after she had vanished from his life without a word. He looked away, swallowing hard. There was something stuck in his throat, grief, guilt, fury. He didn't know which anymore. From beside him, Art spoke quietly. "She's always been like that, sir. Aunt Louisa, I mean." Callum glanced at the boy. "People in our neighborhood always mistreat her, even though she never does anything bad. She's quiet, really kind, doesn't even talk, but they still say horrible things about her." Callum's jaw tightened. "What kind of things?" he asked, voice low and heavy. Art shrugged, hesitant. "They call her crazy, say she escaped some mental facility. Others say she's a prostitute, that Ben was born out of that. Some say she's a thief, too." He trailed off. "I don't understand, sir," he continued, voice almost a whisper. "She doesn't hurt anyone. She's just poor. But even so, it's like people are jealous of her." Callum didn't speak. The words sank deep into his chest, sharp as blades. Crazy. Thief. He didn't know which was more painful, to hear these words used against the woman he loved, or to realize that while he had been building empires, she had been crumbling beneath the world's cruelty. He turned back to Louisa's sleeping face. "Is that why you disappeared?" he thought. "Did something happen you couldn't tell me?" His chest constricted, but one thing became clear in his heart. He would not allow this to continue. He looked at Art and gently squeezed his shoulder. "Thanks for telling me. You're a good kid." Art nodded, unable to speak, but the gratitude in his eyes said enough. Callum stepped out of the room to call his secretary and gave clear instructions to his assistant, Riley. "Cancel all my meetings this week." "But sir," Riley said on the line, "the Russian businessman you're scheduled to meet just arrived in the country." "There's an emergency," Callum said firmly. "I need to stay at the hospital." "Riley's on his way. He'll handle operations in the meantime. Just hold things down." "Yes, sir." "Understood." He ended the call, took a deep breath, and re-entered the hospital room. When he opened the door, Louisa was awake. Ben was in her arms. Callum froze. Louisa looked at him. Her eyes widened as if seeing a ghost. She clutched Ben closer, trembling slightly. Callum couldn't move, rooted to the spot as their eyes locked. Eyes he once adored. Louisa's tears spilled over. Ben turned to see what she was looking at. "Mom," Ben whispered, "that's Mr. Callum. He's the one who helped us." Louisa turned back to Callum, her eyes shining with recognition. "Callum," she breathed, the name escaping her lips. He moved toward her slowly and knelt by her bedside. "Don't be afraid," he said gently, taking her trembling hand. "I'm here now." Without a word, Louisa collapsed into his arms and sobbed. Her entire body trembled with pain, sorrow, and everything she had buried for years. As she held him tight, it felt like she wasn't just hugging him, she was trying to mend the pieces of her shattered heart. Callum said nothing. Not yet. No questions, no accusations, only the comfort of a long overdue embrace. Behind them, Art and Ben watched silently. Ben tugged on Callum's sleeve. "Sir, do you know my mom?" he asked softly. Callum looked at Louisa, then down at the boy. He smiled gently. "Yes," he replied. "She used to be my whole world." Ben didn't quite understand what that meant, but Callum knew it wasn't yet time to reveal the past. Ben was too young. There was still much to process. For now, what mattered was that Louisa knew she was safe and not alone. Louisa had fallen asleep again, exhausted from crying. Callum sat beside her hospital bed, his hands still wrapped gently around hers. Ben sat on the small couch nearby, head leaning against the wall, trying not to fall asleep himself. Art had gone home for the night after Callum insisted. The boy had done enough already. The room was quiet now, except for the soft beeping of medical monitors. Callum watched Louisa asleep. Her face, even now, was soft and gentle. But the signs of suffering were there: sunken cheeks, pale lips, deep shadows under her eyes. She looked like someone who had been through a war and barely made it out alive. He felt anger rising again. Who had done this to her? Where had she gone all those years ago? Why had she disappeared without a word? Why hadn't she come to him? He had searched for months. He had searched for her until everyone convinced him she was gone for good. But she wasn't gone. She was here, living in poverty, abused by neighbors, surviving in silence with a child. His gaze drifted toward Ben, now half asleep. Benjamin, the name rolled through his thoughts again and again. So many questions. Too many. Was he? Could he be? Callum's chest tightened. It was too soon. He couldn't jump to conclusions, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling either. Ben looked too much like someone he used to know. And the timeline it could fit. He stood and quietly stepped outside the hospital room, pulling out his phone. "Riley," he said when the call connected. "Yes, sir." "Do me a favor discreetly. I want a background check done on Louisa Asterio and her son Benjamin." There was a short pause. "Right away, sir." Callum ended the call, shoving the phone into his pocket. He exhaled deeply and leaned against the wall, staring at the hallway floor. The past had returned, and this time he wouldn't let it slip away again. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the hospital window. Louisa slowly opened her eyes, blinking. against the brightness. For a moment, confusion crossed her face until she turned her head and saw her son sleeping on the couch. Then she saw Callum seated quietly by the window, reading documents. Her breath caught. She turned her face away. Callum stood immediately. "You're awake," he said gently. She didn't respond. He walked to her side slowly, placing the papers on the bedside table. "Do you need anything?" he asked. Still, she said nothing. Louisa stared blankly at the ceiling, then at Ben, as if afraid he might disappear if she blinked. Callum sat on the edge of the chair beside her bed. "I didn't expect to see you again," he said softly. "After all these years, I thought you were gone." She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers clenching the edge of the blanket. Callum leaned forward. "Louisa, I don't know what happened, but I want to understand. Please." Her chest rose and fell, still no words. "I searched for you," he continued. "I looked everywhere. But one day, you were just gone. No explanation, no message, no goodbye." Her lips trembled. "I thought you left me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Then I found you again," Callum said, voice cracking, "and you were like this, broken, abused, afraid." Silence. He wiped his face quickly and tried to compose himself. "Why, Louisa?" he asked, pained. "Why didn't you tell me? What happened to you?" Her throat tightened. She closed her eyes, unable to hold back the tears now. Callum waited. When she finally turned to face him, her lips parted, but the words didn't come. "Not yet." A soft voice from the couch broke the tension. "Mom." Ben sat up, rubbing his eyes. He saw Louisa crying and rushed over to her side. "What's wrong, Mom? Are you in pain? Are you okay?" She shook her head quickly, hugging him tightly. "I'm okay," she whispered hoarsely. Callum was stunned. It was the first time he'd heard her voice since they reunited. Ben turned to Callum. "Sir, thank you for helping us." Callum nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Louisa. "We're not done, Louisa," he said softly. "You don't have to tell me now, but someday I need to know everything." Louisa looked down. She knew that day was coming. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to face the truth. 2 days passed. Louisa remained in the hospital for observation. Her condition was improving, though she remained fragile physically and emotionally. Ben rarely left her side. He would only step out when Callum insisted he eat or rest. Callum, meanwhile, kept busy managing work from the hospital's waiting lounge, juggling phone calls and documents while making sure Louisa and Ben had everything they needed. Each morning, he brought fresh fruit, clean clothes, and warm food. Nurses and staff began to notice how deeply he cared, though he rarely spoke of it. Riley arrived mid-morning with a thin folder. "Sir," he said discreetly, handing it over. "Everything you requested." Callum nodded and opened the folder carefully. Inside were documents, birth records, hospital logs, and an official summary of Louisa's recent years. He scanned through the papers. His eyes stopped at one name, Benjamin Asterio, mother, Louisa Asterio, father, unknown. His breath caught. There was no name listed under the father's section, but the birth date. He did the math and felt the air leave his lungs. "That year, that month, that was after she left me." His hands trembled slightly. Riley stood quietly nearby, watching his boss absorb the truth. "She gave birth shortly after disappearing," Riley said gently. "No record of the father ever filed. She never spoke of it." Callum closed the folder slowly. He didn't say anything, but in his heart, he knew Benjamin was his son. That evening, Callum sat alone on a bench just outside the hospital. The night was cool, the wind calm. He held the folder in his hands, unopened now, but its contents burned through his chest. He could hear Benjamin's laughter through the window above. The boy was showing his mother something he had drawn on a notepad. Louisa's soft voice responded, still gentle, still hesitant. Callum stood and walked back to the room. Inside, Ben looked up and waved. "Sir Callum, look what I drew." He held up a sketch of a small house with flowers outside and two smiling figures holding hands, a boy and a woman. "That's me and Mom," Ben said proudly. Louisa smiled faintly but lowered her gaze the moment Callum entered. Callum stepped in, still holding the folder. He walked closer and knelt in front of Ben. "Can I talk to your mom for a moment?" he asked kindly. "Just the two of us." Ben looked at her, then at Callum, and nodded. "Okay, I'll go outside." As soon as he stepped out, closing the door behind him, Callum gently placed the folder on the table near Louisa's bed. She looked at it but said nothing. He sat in the chair beside her and took a deep breath. "I know now," he said quietly. "About Benjamin." Louisa froze. "You didn't list the father's name," Callum added. "But the dates, they match." Still, she didn't speak. "I know he's mine." Tears welled in Louisa's eyes. "I searched for you," he continued, voice soft. "When you vanished, I thought maybe you got tired of me or that you left because I didn't propose fast enough. I blamed myself." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his head bowed. "But you were pregnant and alone." A single tear fell from her cheek. "I would have been there," he whispered. "If you had told me." Louisa's hands gripped the blanket tightly. "I was scared," she finally said, her voice cracked with the weight of buried years. "I didn't know what to do." Callum looked at her, his eyes now filled with emotion. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. Not again." He reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Louisa's fingers trembled in Callum's grasp. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, as though she was bracing herself to open a wound that had never healed. "I didn't disappear because I wanted to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Callum stayed still, listening. "I was going to tell you that night," she continued, "about the baby." Her throat tightened. "But I never made it to your place. Someone followed me. I thought I was safe, just walking. But then everything happened so fast. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight them. It felt like the world stopped." Callum's chest clenched, his hands curled into fists. "I woke up in an alley," she said, shaking now, bleeding, in pain, and everything felt broken. She wiped her eyes, then kept going, as if afraid she'd lose the courage if she paused. "I went to the clinic. I thought maybe I lost the baby, but they told me I was still pregnant." She finally turned to him, her eyes wide with pain. "I didn't know whose baby it was, Callum. Yours or theirs." A sharp gasp escaped him. He sat back, breathless. "That's why I left," she said, voice crumbling. "That's why I didn't come to you. I didn't want you to be tied to something so ugly. I didn't know what kind of child I was carrying. I didn't want to ruin your life." She wept into her hands, all the years of silence crashing into the room. Callum stood up and turned away, struggling to contain his grief, his rage, his heartbreak. But then he turned back and knelt in front of her again. "You didn't ruin anything," he said, firm but gentle. "You protected your son. You raised him with love. You gave him everything you had." He reached out and lifted her chin, gently forcing her to meet his eyes. "And I don't care how he came into this world, Louisa. He's mine. I see it. I feel it." Louisa sobbed again, and this time she collapsed into his arms. And Callum held her, not out of pity, but out of love long buried, now finally uncovered. Outside the hospital room, Benjamin sat on a bench, his legs swinging slightly as he stared at the hallway floor. He didn't understand everything, but he knew something important was happening inside. He clutched the small notebook he always carried, its pages filled with doodles and letters he'd copied from old books. The nurses passed by, smiling at him. He smiled back, but his eyes remained anxious. A few minutes later, the door opened. Callum stepped out quietly. Ben looked up right away. "Sir, is Mom okay?" Callum nodded and walked over. He knelt down in front of the boy. "She's okay," he said. "She just needed to talk about something important. She's resting now." Ben nodded slowly. "Sir," he started, gripping the notebook tighter, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Callum replied gently. "Do you think someday we can have a real house?" Callum was stunned for a moment. Ben looked down, embarrassed. "I mean, a house with a roof that doesn't leak and a kitchen that has a fridge and maybe a yard, even if it's small. Just something better for Mom." Callum smiled softly. "Yes, Ben," he said. "I think you and your mom deserve more than that, and I promise I'll do what I can to help." Ben's eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" Ben's smile slowly returned, bright and wide. "Then I'll work harder, too. I'll study hard and make you both proud." Callum placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already make me proud." Ben tilted his head. "Huh?" Callum just ruffled his hair. Someday the boy would know the full truth. But for now, this moment, this quiet, tender moment, was enough. 2 weeks later, Louisa was discharged from the hospital. Callum insisted on handling the bills. She resisted at first, but he gently explained, "This isn't charity. It's me making up for lost time." He had also arranged for a private vehicle to take them, not back to the old neighborhood, but to a new place. Ben looked out the window in awe as they drove past streets he had never seen before. Trees lined the sidewalks. The houses were clean and spacious. Quiet filled the air instead of the noise of shouting vendors or clanging carts. When the car pulled into a driveway, Ben's eyes widened even more. "Where are we, sir?" he asked Callum. Louisa's brow furrowed in confusion. Callum stepped out and opened the door for them. "This is your new home," he said calmly. Louisa froze. "Callum," she said. He turned to her. "No more arguments. It's safe. It's clean. And it's yours. You and Ben deserve to live with dignity." Tears welled in her eyes. Ben ran toward the small front porch, squealing in joy. "It's got a mailbox and a front door with a real doorknob." Callum chuckled and walked Louisa slowly to the entrance. Inside, everything was modest but warm: 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, soft couches, clean tiles. The fridge hummed softly. Curtains framed the living room window. Louisa covered her mouth as she walked through the doorway. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Callum stood beside her. "There's a room just for Ben. Books, clothes, a study desk. I thought he might like it." Ben had already found it and was shouting excitedly. "Mom, it has pillows and a lamp. I have my own light." Louisa turned to him, eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," Callum said, "but I wanted to." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." That night, for the first time in a long while, they all sat around a real table for dinner. There were no candle stubs, no broken plates, just warm food, steady lights, and quiet laughter. And as Callum watched them, mother and son, his family, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Weeks passed. The wounds didn't vanish overnight, but life gradually took on a rhythm that neither Louisa nor Ben had ever known before. Each morning, Ben woke up in his own bed under clean sheets, greeted by sunlight filtering through real curtains. He brushed his teeth in a bathroom with running water and sat at a table where breakfast was already waiting, prepared by his mom, who smiled more now and seemed lighter than before. Callum visited often. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes new books for Ben, sometimes nothing, just himself and a quiet presence that was slowly weaving itself into the fabric of their lives. Louisa didn't talk much at first, but her silence was no longer the kind that came from fear. She spoke when she wanted to, and when she did, it was with clarity, strength, and warmth. One Sunday afternoon, Callum arrived with a small stack of folders under his arm. Ben greeted him at the gate. "Sir Callum, want to see the tomatoes Mom planted? They're getting big." "Later," Callum said with a smile. "But first, I need to talk to your mom." He walked inside and found Louisa wiping down the kitchen counter. She turned and gave a gentle nod. I have something I want to ask you, he said, laying the folders on the table. Louisa looked curious but didn't speak. I've been thinking, Callum continued, about what it means to make things right. I know I can't change the past. I can't erase what happened to you or what you've carried all these years. But if there's a way to give you security, peace of mind, and a future, I want to offer that. He opened the top folder. Inside were property documents. This house, he said, is in your name now. I've transferred ownership. It's yours. Officially. Louisa's eyes widened. Callum. No more rent. No more threats. No more wondering if you and Ben will have a roof over your heads. This is your home permanently. Her voice caught. You didn't have to. I did, he interrupted softly. Because I want to do right by you and by him. He handed her a second folder. And this one, Ben's school. I've already spoken with the administrators. He can start next week. She opened it slowly and saw the enrollment forms, the school crest, the supply list. Her hands trembled. He'll have uniforms, meals, books. He won't need to work anymore. He can be a kid the way he deserves to be. Louisa pressed the folder to her chest and bowed her head. Thank you, she whispered. Callum stepped closer. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to be here, however you'll allow me. She looked up at him, and for the first time since that awful night years ago, she smiled without pain behind it. And outside in the yard, Benjamin laughed and chased a butterfly through the flowers. It was a clear, breezy Saturday morning, and Benjamin sat on the grass outside their new home, folding paper into different shapes: airplanes, boats, cranes. His tongue peeked out slightly in concentration as he lined the folds just right. From the porch, Callum watched, sipping coffee. He's good with his hands, he commented. Louisa nodded beside him, shelling peas into a bowl. He always has been. Even when he didn't have toys, he'd find things, twigs, old wrappers, cardboard, and make something out of them. Callum smiled. You raised him well. She looked up at him with quiet gratitude. Just then, one of the paper planes took flight, high, long, and steady, until it crash-landed softly at Callum's feet. Ben ran over, laughing. Did you see that? It almost made it to the street. I saw, Callum chuckled. That one was perfect. Ben picked it up, glanced at both adults, then hesitated. Sir Callum, he said more softly, can I ask something again? Of course, Callum replied. Do you think you could come with us to school on my first day? Louisa stilled. Callum looked at her, then at Ben. I'd love to, he said gently. Ben's face lit up. Cool. You can see my classroom and meet my teacher. They said parents are allowed on the first day. Louisa gave a small nod, the tiniest smile on her lips. Callum reached out and placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. I wouldn't miss it for the world. They stood there, the three of them, the silence between them no longer empty but full of understanding, and behind them, the paper planes waited to fly again. The morning of Ben's first day of school arrived. He wore a brand new uniform, crisp polo, neatly ironed pants, and a backpack filled with books and supplies. His hair was combed carefully, and he stood in front of the mirror, inspecting himself with wide-eyed excitement. Louisa stood beside him, adjusting his collar. You look so handsome, she said softly. Ben grinned. You think the other kids will like me? They'll love you, she assured him, kissing his forehead. A car horn sounded outside. Callum was already waiting. Ben rushed out the door, holding Louisa's hand tightly. Callum stepped out of the car and opened the door for them. Ready for the big day? Ben nodded quickly, climbing into the back seat. I can't wait. Louisa followed quietly, her heart thudding with both pride and nervousness. The drive to school was calm, lined with sunlight peeking through trees. Ben talked nonstop about the subjects he wanted to learn: his science, reading, maybe art. At the school gates, parents and children bustled about. Teachers guided students toward classrooms. Callum held Louisa's hand gently to steady her. You okay? She gave a nervous smile. I've just never done this before, dropped him off like this. He's in good hands now, Callum said. And so are you. Ben ran ahead toward the line of students, then turned around. Come on, Mom, Sir Callum, don't you want to see my classroom? They followed. Inside, the room was bright and colorful. Desks lined the floor in neat rows. Books, posters, and drawings covered the walls. Ben went straight to a desk with his name on it and sat proudly. Louisa stood near the doorway, watching him. Her eyes shimmered. Callum slipped an arm gently around her waist. The teacher approached with a smile. You must be Benjamin's parents. There was a pause. Callum glanced at Louisa. She looked at him, then turned to the teacher and said, Yes, we are. The teacher beamed. He's a sweet boy. I think he'll do just fine here. Ben turned and waved at them from his seat. Louisa waved back, whispering, Good luck, baby. And as she and Callum walked back out together, she knew this was the life she had only dared to dream of. And now it was finally beginning. That night, the house was quiet. Dinner had been simple: grilled chicken, steamed rice, and sautéed greens. Ben had talked endlessly about his first day, excitedly describing his seatmate, the books, the snacks, and how the teacher had praised his penmanship. Now he was asleep in his room, arms wrapped around a stuffed bear Callum had given him a week earlier. In the living room, Louisa sat curled on the couch, a cup of tea in her hands. Callum stood by the window, looking out at the faint glow of the porch light. After a while, he turned to her. Can I stay a little longer? He asked quietly. Louisa looked up and gave a small nod. He sat across from her, the air between them filled with the soft ticking of a nearby clock. I keep thinking, Callum began, about all the time we lost. Louisa lowered her eyes. I know I said I don't need explanations, but I do still wonder sometimes. Why didn't you tell me about Ben after he was born? She didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, she said, I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see what I'd become. You hadn't become anything, Louisa, he said firmly. You were hurt, abandoned, and still you survived. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you the strongest person I know. She met his eyes, hers clouded with emotion. I thought about you every day, she whispered. I imagined what you might say if you saw me with a baby and no explanation. I told myself I was doing the right thing, even if it broke my heart. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I would have taken care of both of you, he said. You never would have had to suffer. But I did, she replied. And I lived, and so did he. They sat in silence again. Finally, Callum stood and crossed the room. He knelt before her, took her cup, and set it aside. Louisa, he said softly, whatever happened, whatever was taken from us, I don't care anymore. She looked at him, eyes wide. I just want to be with you, he said. With you and Ben, if you'll let me. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I'm scared, she admitted. I know, he whispered. So am I. And slowly, he reached for her hand. And this time, she didn't pull away. The next morning, sunlight poured gently into the kitchen, casting a soft glow over the counter where Louisa stood, whisking eggs. The scent of toast filled the air, mingling with fresh coffee. Ben rushed in, half-dressed and barefoot, his school polo wrinkled. Mom, I can't find my socks. They're folded on your pillow, she called out, smiling. Oh. He darted back to his room. Callum entered a moment later, straightening his sleeves. Morning, he said, watching her. Morning, Louisa replied, pouring the eggs into a pan. He stepped beside her and reached for a mug. You always cook this early? She shrugged lightly. I like the quiet. Ben came back, now fully dressed, backpack slung over one shoulder. I'm ready. Louisa placed his lunchbox into his bag. You have everything? He nodded quickly. Yep, even my math homework. Callum offered him a high five. "That's my boy." Ben grinned and took his hand in a quick slap before heading toward the front door. "Let's go, or I'll be late." Louisa grabbed her keys, but Callum gently stopped her. "I'll take him," he offered. "You rest." Louisa hesitated, then gave a soft nod. "See you later, Mom," Ben called, waving. She stood at the doorway and watched them walk down the sidewalk, Callum gently guiding Ben to the car. The boy bounced with excitement, talking non-stop. She stood there long after they drove off, sunlight warming her arms, wind lifting her hair slightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence surrounding her wasn't empty. It was peaceful. A month passed. Ben had settled well into school, already earning praise for his handwriting, his kindness, and his curiosity. Callum continued to visit nearly every day, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with plans, other times just to sit on the porch with Louisa, sipping coffee, and watching Ben draw chalk figures on the pavement. Louisa was healing. The bruises had faded, the nervousness softened, and her laughter returned little by little. She still had quiet moments, periods where her gaze drifted to nowhere, haunted by a memory. But they didn't last as long as before. One Saturday morning, Callum invited them to a botanical garden on the edge of the city. "I thought it would be nice to get some fresh air," he said. Louisa hesitated. "We won't stay long," he added. "Just a few hours. Bring a sweater, it gets breezy there." Eventually, she agreed. They walked the garden paths under wide flowering trees. Ben skipped ahead, chasing butterflies and reading signs aloud. The quiet was soothing, filled only with bird calls and the rustling of leaves. Callum guided Louisa toward a bench under a tall oak. They sat, watching Ben run ahead with a fallen stick in his hand, pretending to be a knight. Callum took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," he said. Louisa turned to him. "I know we've been taking things slow, and I'll always respect your pace, but I also know what I want now, and I'm not afraid to say it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, simple box. Louisa's breath caught. "This isn't about fixing the past," he said quietly. "It's about building a future, one where you never have to feel alone again. One where Ben grows up knowing what it feels like to be safe and loved." He opened the box. Inside was a thin silver band, modest but elegant. "Louisa," he said, voice steady but soft, "will you marry me?" She stared at the ring, then at him, overwhelmed. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Ben's voice broke the moment. "Mom, look, a turtle." They both laughed. Louisa looked back at Callum, tears in her eyes, and she nodded. The wedding was small, just a garden behind a family-owned cafe on the outskirts of town. No grandeur, no velvet aisle runners, just soft music, folding chairs, and the scent of fresh flowers. Ben wore a white button-up shirt and navy suspenders. He stood proudly beside Callum, clutching the ring pillow like it was treasure. Louisa wore a cream-colored dress, simple and elegant. Her hair was pulled into a soft braid. She walked down the short aisle slowly, arm in arm with one of the women from the shelter who had once taken her in during her darkest days. Callum couldn't take his eyes off her. She was no longer the fragile figure he had found trembling in a hospital bed. She was whole. She was home. When she reached him, he took her hand, steady and warm. The vows were brief, spoken with conviction. When Callum said, "I do," his voice didn't waver. When Louisa whispered, "I do," her smile trembled, but only from joy. Ben beamed as he handed over the rings. The guests clapped and wiped their eyes as Callum kissed his bride. Later, at the modest reception under the garden lights, Ben stood on a chair and raised his glass of apple juice. "To my new family," he shouted. Laughter and applause followed. Louisa pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair. Callum joined them, arms wrapping around both. In that moment, nothing else existed, no past wounds, no fears, no ghosts, only a woman who had survived, a man who had waited, and a boy who had brought them back together. Morning sunlight bathed their small front yard as Ben rode his bike in loops down the driveway, laughing with every turn. The training wheels had just come off. Callum stood nearby with a camera in hand, cheering each wobble and recovery. Louisa leaned against the porch railing, sipping her tea, eyes soft with contentment. Everything felt new now, even in its simplicity. Inside the house, the fridge was covered in drawings, rockets, stars, stick figures with curly hair labeled Mom and Dad. School awards were pinned to a corkboard by the kitchen, and a calendar held circled dates for dentist appointments, parent-teacher meetings, and Ben's first spelling bee. There were still quiet days when Louisa would stare out the window longer than usual, or nights when she'd wake from a dream and sit up suddenly, gasping for air. But those moments passed more quickly now, soothed by a warm hand reaching across the bed, by whispered words of comfort, by the steady breathing of someone beside her who never let go. Callum had adjusted, too. The once invincible executive now came home with paint on his shirt from helping Ben with art projects. He learned to cook pancakes badly and to braid Louisa's hair on quiet Sundays when she asked, just to laugh at his crooked attempt. And Ben, he was growing fast, taller, louder, braver. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch steps beside Callum, he asked the question that had long sat between them. "Sir Callum, can I call you Dad now?" Callum didn't speak at first. He turned to Ben, eyes full of warmth. "I'd love that," he said. Ben smiled, wide and sure. "Okay, Dad." Louisa, standing just inside the doorway, wiped a tear from her cheek. Their lives, once broken in pieces, had become something whole again. Not perfect, but real and full of love. Years passed. The small house grew with time, more plants along the porch, wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze, framed school photos of Ben lining the hallway walls. New memories settled into every corner, softening the echoes of what once was. Ben thrived. He graduated elementary school with honors, then middle school, then high school. Each milestone was marked with laughter, with family photos in the yard, with Louisa crying softly and Callum standing proudly by their side. And through it all, the love that had once been lost only deepened. Callum and Louisa never moved far. They never needed more than what they had: safety, peace, and each other. Neighbors came to admire them, not because they were perfect, but because they were proof that healing was possible, that love could survive anything, that even the deepest wounds could close, given time, patience, and tenderness. One quiet evening, after Ben had left for college, Callum and Louisa sat on the porch swing, their hands intertwined, listening to the sound of cicadas in the trees. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender. The air was warm. "I never imagined," Louisa said softly, "that life could be this quiet." Callum smiled. "It's the kind of quiet we earned." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" "Never," he answered. "Every second let us hear." She nodded, eyes closed, heart full. And as the stars began to peek out one by one, they rocked slowly in that swing, side by side, hearts at peace. They had come through the fire. And on the other side, they had found each other again, not broken, but whole, always. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Dark Voices. I am your host, Mr. Hope. Until we meet again, I love you all.